Hello, we're going to make a video on the skull bones today. You have a list of your skull bones either on OneNote or on Connect. We're going to go over the bones of the cranium. These are the bones, the flat bones that cover the brain. So we have the frontal bone. The frontal bone is found on the front of the skull, on the sides of the skull, and the top we have the parietal bones. The parietal bones are divided down the middle by a suture. This is called the sagittal suture. The suture that divides the frontal bone from the parietal bones is called the coronal suture. The bone that's found on the side of the head is called the temporal bone, and that is divided from the parietal bone up here by this suture right here. This is called the squamous suture. And the last of the bones is on the back of the skull. This is called the occipital bone. And the occipital bone is what my skull is resting on right here. It's divided by from the parietal bones here and here by this suture right here that's called the lambdoid suture. So I'm going to go to the exploded skull and show you the flat bones. This is our exploded skull, so it's all the bones separated so you can see them independently. We have the frontal bone, we have the coronal suture, we have the parietal bones, which are divided by the sagittal suture. We have the occipital bone, which is divided by the lambdoid suture from the parietal bones. And we have the temporal bone, which is divided from the parietal bones by the squamous suture. I've turned one of my skulls upside down so we can get a good look at the architecture of the occipital bone. Remember, the occipital bone is divided from the parietal bones by the lambdoid suture. And the first thing we're going to look at is this nice hole right here. This is where the spinal cord meets the brainstem. This is called the foramen magnum. Right here and right here are two bony prominences. Can you tell them on the video? These are called occipital condyles, and they articulate with the first cervical vertebra that's called the atlas. The temporal bone is the bone that's found on the side of the head, and the architecture that's found here would be the external acoustic meatus. That's this hole right here. If you stick your finger in your ear, you would stick it in the external acoustic meatus. We also have the mastoid process. It's this rounded process right here that comes off the inferior surface of the temporal bone. We also have the area right here where the bottom jaw, the lower jaw, which is called the mandible, articulates with the temporal process. So this is called the mandibular fossa. Let me give you a better look at this. Let me orient you. We have a skull here. I'm going to flip it upside down. And I'm going to put my finger in the mandibular fossa. This is the area where the mandible makes a hinge with the temporal bone. And can you see that little indentation right there? Okay, so it fits just like this. See? Can you see that? The next part of the temporal bone is this looks like a high heel right here. You can see it here, and you can also see it on the opposite side of the skull right here. Right there. That little process that's coming down, that's called the styloid process. The styloid process of the temporal bone. Then the last thing that we'll see on here is the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch makes up the cheekbone. It's this guy right here. So the zygomatic arch is actually made up of a part of two bones. So this is called the zygomatic bone, your cheekbone. And this is your temporal bone right here. So this would be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and this would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and together they make up the zygomatic arch. The next bone is this butterfly-shaped bone or bat-shaped bone. This is called the sphenoid bone. So the sphenoid bone is actually found on the floor of the skull. So it would fit just like this in the floor of the skull. It makes up part of the bony area of the orbit where your eye fits. If we turn this around, it would be back here. So part of the floor of the orbit. So this is your sphenoid bone. Part of the sphenoid bone that you need to know is the area called the sella turcica. So I'm going to take my intact skull. You can see this butterfly shape right here on the interior of the floor of the skull. That is the wings of the sphenoid bone. The sella turcica is found right here. This is a little indentation in that bone, and that's where the pituitary gland sits. If I look at the exploded skull here, one of the maxilla, which is the upper jaw, has been removed. But the sphenoid bone is right here. I'll outline it for you if I can. So that's where the sphenoid bone sits. So the next bone we're going to talk about is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone makes up your nasal turbinates, which are inside of your nasal cavity. So it's this rectangular shaped bone right here. So let me pull back. It's this rectangular shaped bone right here. So this is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is also found on the floor of your skull. So let me show you where that fits. It fits right here. So this is the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone has some architecture that you need to know. This little point right here, which is this point. Boy, this is hard to shoot a video like this. So this little point right here on the ethmoid bone, that's called the crista galli. The crista galli is going to separate when we talk about the olfactory lobes. That's the first part of your cranial nerve, number one, which is your olfactory nerve, is going to fit right in this area where I'm sticking my finger. So the crista galli is going to divide the olfactory lobes into the right side and the left side. Then can you see there is an area where there's a lot of little holes in it, right? On the bone itself, it's these little holes. This is called the cribriform plate. So as the nerves from your nose pass up into your olfactory bulb, they pass through those little holes. That's called the cribriform plate. If I take the ethmoid bone and I flip it upside down, this is going to be part of what makes up the interior of your nasal cavity, those nasal turbinates. This is called the perpendicular plate, and let me show you where that is on the skull. So the perpendicular plate is found right here. So this is the bottom of that ethmoid bone. If I take my ethmoid bone and I flip it like this, can you see that middle kind of scroll-shaped fragile bone in the center? That is deep in there, and that forms part of your nasal cavity in there. So that is your ethmoid bone. The next bone is your lacrimal bone. Your lacrimal bone makes up the medial portion of the interior of the orbit. So this is your lacrimal bone. The next bone is your palatine bone. Your palatine bone is this little bone that's found right here. It makes up the caudal portion or the posterior portion of your hard palate. The anterior part of your hard palate is part of your maxillary bone. Your maxillary bone makes up your upper jaw. So this is your maxillary bone. So you have a left side and a right maxillary. Let me show it to you on this skull. That one has a lot of teeth shown. So this would be the right maxillary and the left maxillary bone. Okay, then we will have the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone is this bone right here. Got one on the other side as well. That's the zygomatic bone. The next bone is your nasal bone. This is your nasal bone across the top portion of your nose. Then we have the vomer bone. The vomer bone is the inferior bone that makes up the other part of your nasal septum along with the perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone. So there's your vomer bone. The next bone is your mandible and your last bone. The mandible is your lower jaw bone. On your mandibular bone, we have the coronoid process. We have the mandibular condyle. The whole bone is the mandible. And the last thing that we have is the mandibular foramen. The mandibular foramen is this little tiny hole. Whoops, kind of hard to point at here. It's this little tiny hole where the hinge ends. There's a little foramen there. There we go. And that's where a nerve comes out. If you've ever had a tooth pulled, they're going to numb that on your mandible. And I believe that is everything that you need to know about the mandible. That ends the video on the skull bones. I hope that helps. Have a good day.